Hey guys, welcome back to Ask a CPA, your go-to channel for all things tax related. I'm Brett Phillips, and today we got a topic that can save you significant money in taxes. If you're considering or have recently adopted a child, then this video is for you. But before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and bell notification so you never miss out on any valuable tax advice. I'll try to address all of the questions in this video, but please feel free to leave a comment down below with any specific questions related to the adoption tax credit, and I'll respond to those questions as quickly as possible. So this week, I sat down with a young couple going down the road of an adoption. After a long fight with infertility, they have decided to make their family complete through the adoption process. As they have come to find out, adoption is expensive and there is a lot of nuances related to the tax credit. The cost of adopting a child can be anywhere from $5,000 all the way up to $60,000. These numbers can vary significantly based on which adoption agency is used, whether the child is a U.S. citizen or comes from another country, or whether the child is adopted through fostering. So after significant research and a few long conversations with my client, these are the main topics in which we covered and which we're going to be covering in today's video. So first, what is an eligible child for the adoption tax credit? Next, what is the adoption tax credit? What is the special needs exemption? What are qualified adoption expenses? Can you claim the credit for a failed adoption? What are employer-provided adoption benefits? How can I show proof of my adoption expenses? And how can I claim the adoption tax credit? And finally, when can I claim the adoption tax credit? All right, these are a lot of information in today's video. This is going to be a longer video, and I will document all of the questions down below with the spots in the video in which they lay. So let's go ahead and dive into it. The first question is, what is an eligible child for the adoption tax credit? So the IRS defines an eligible child as any person under the age of 18 or any person who, regardless of age, qualifies as disabled and physically or mentally unable to care for themselves. So unfortunately, adopting a stepchild does not qualify for the adoption tax credit. If you are not married, it is not considered a step-parent adoption, so you can still claim the adoption tax credit if you have any qualified adoption expenses. The adoption tax credit is a non-refundable tax credit meant to provide you with relief for the qualified cost you pay when adopting a child. For 2023 adoptions, the maximum adoption credit amount is $15,950 per child. The credit will begin to phase out when families with a modified adjusted gross income exceed $239,230, and the credit will completely phase out when those incomes exceed $279,230. Since the credit is per child, the maximum you can claim depends on the number of children in which you adopt. If you adopted 2 children in 2023, your maximum credit is $15,950 times 2, or $31,900. If you adopt 3 children, the maximum amount would be $15,950 times 3, or $47,850. For purposes of the tax credit, there is no limit to the number of children you can adopt. To claim the credit, you have to file Form 8839, the Qualified Adoption Expense Form, and meet the modified adjusted gross income limits I previously mentioned. Because of the non-refundable nature of the credit, if you can't use the entire credit's value in the first year in which you claim it, you can carry forward the remaining amounts for up to 5 years. For example, let's assume your total income for 2023 is $80,000 and your tax liability is $10,000. If you claim the full credit in 2023, your tax liability will be $0, and the remaining $5,950 credit balance rolls forward into the following year. Any withholdings you paid in during the year will be fully refunded, and the remaining tax credit will carry forward to 2024. To find your tax liability, check line 18 on your Form 1040. The credit amount you claim relates to how much you spend on the adoption. For example, if you paid $7,000 in qualified adoption expenses in 2023, you can't claim the full $15,950 credit. Likewise, if you paid $60,000 in expenses, you can only claim the maximum credit value of $15,950. Adopting a child whom the state has determined has special needs comes with specific tax considerations. In the case of the adoption tax credit, special needs doesn't necessarily mean a child has a disability or medical condition. For the adoption tax credit, a child with special needs is one who's classified as hard to place for adoption without financial assistance. To qualify as a child with special needs, they must meet each of these three conditions. First, the child is a citizen or resident of the United States. Second, the state determines that the child shouldn't or couldn't be returned to the parent's home. And third, the state determines that the child probably wouldn't have been adopted unless the assistance was provided. Now, if you adopted a child with special needs, you are generally eligible to claim the full credit in the year the adoption was finalized. Now, if you don't know whether your child qualifies for the special needs category, you should review your adoption paperwork and check with your state agency or social worker. Once you adopt your child and claim the adoption tax credit, you won't receive additional federal tax benefits related to the adoption in future years. From this point on, your child will qualify as a dependent on your personal tax return. If you've chosen to adopt a child, you can claim the adoption credit toward any out-of-pocket qualified adoption expenses. You can count these expenses even before you've identified an eligible child. Now, the IRS defines qualified adoption expenses as any reasonable and necessary expenses directly related to the legal adoption of a child. These become eligible for reimbursement or refund through the adoption tax credit. The IRS says qualified adoption expenses are reasonable and necessary expenses directly related to and for the principal purpose of the legal adoption of an eligible child. Qualified adoption expenses include adoption fees, attorney fees, court costs, travel expenses, including meals and lodging while away from home, and readoption expenses related to the adoption of a foreign child. Qualified adoption expenses do not include expenses for which you received funds under any state, local, or federal program that violate state or federal law, for carrying out a surrogate parenting arrangement, paid or reimbursed by your employer or any other person or organization, or allowed as a credit or deduction under any other provision of federal income tax law. Qualified adoption expenses do not include any expenses you pay to adopt the child of your spouse. In other words, adopting your stepchild does not qualify as eligible adoption expenses. So can you claim the credit for a failed adoption? And the answer is yes. If it is a U.S. adoption and you had qualified adoption expenses, it is treated as a non-finalized adoption and you must wait 1 year after you incur the expenses to claim the credit. So if you had expenses for an adoption in 2023, but the adoption has failed, you can still claim the credit on your 2024 taxes, typically filed in early 2025. If you have a failed international adoption, you cannot claim the credit until the adoption is finalized. The expenses incurred on the failed adoption can be combined with the additional fees incurred with the successful adoption. Additionally, if you had a failed U.S. adoption but later adopted successfully, you cannot claim the credit twice. A taxpayer may be eligible for employer-provided adoption benefits, assuming your employer provides this benefit. According to the IRS, employer-provided adoption benefits are amounts your employer paid for qualified adoption-related expenses to you directly or to a third party on your behalf. You can exclude these benefits from your taxable income up to the credit amount of $15,950 for tax year 2023. but you cannot use the same expense for the exclusion as you do for the credit. You can, however, exclude up to the maximum allowable amount and then take the maximum credit for the additional unreimbursed expenses. However, adopted parents shouldn't automatically assume they qualify. You can claim the maximum amount of the adoption credit only if you spend that amount for qualified adoption expenses and they weren't reimbursed by an employer or state agency. You can also claim the full credit if you adopt a person who has special needs. So you'll need a copy of the adoption certificate signed by the judge. Now this should show the names of you, your spouse, and the child along with the seal of the court. In previous years, the IRS required you to attach this adoption certificate to your return, but this is no longer necessary. You'll still want to keep this documentation for your own records. Now, you should always expect to provide evidence of any expenses you hope to claim for the adoption tax credit. Also, make sure you save any documentation certifying your adopted child qualifies as a child with special needs. Now, this can include a signed adoption assistance or subsidy agreement by the state, a state-issued or county-issued certificate of verification that the child has special needs, or a certificate that the child is approved to receive adoption assistance. To claim the adoption tax credit, complete Form 8839 and attach it to your Form 1040. Again, you no longer need to attach the adoption documentation with your federal tax return, but you should keep this documentation for your records. Now, if you have an international or special needs adoption, you can claim the credit in the year in which you finalize the adoption. You cannot claim the credit for a non-finalized international adoption. Now, for domestic non-special needs adoptions, you must claim the expenses either the year you finalize or for non-finalized adoptions the year after you paid the expenses. So if you finalized an adoption in 2023, but you had expenses from 2020 through 2023, you must claim the 2020 expenses with your 2021 tax return, the 2021 expenses with your 2022 tax return, and the 2022 expenses on your 2023 tax return. The maximum credit will be based on the year in which the adoption is finalized. For special needs adoptions without expenses, you claim the maximum amount of the credit in the year in which the adoption is finalized. For failed U.S. special needs adoptions, you can only claim the expenses you had, not the maximum credit amount. And again, you would have to wait until the tax year in which you had the expenses. Now, for special needs adoptions without expenses, you claim the maximum amount of the credit in the year the adoption is finalized. For failed U.S. special needs adoptions, you can only claim the expenses in which you had. And again, you have to wait until the tax year after you had the expenses. So there you have it, guys, an overview of the adoption tax credit. If you've recently adopted a child or are planning to, make sure to take full advantage of this tax credit. It's a way for the government to support the incredible act of giving a child a loving home. As always, consult with a tax professional for your most up-to-date information and personalized tax advice. If you found this video helpful, please give it a big thumbs up and make sure to share it with others who may benefit from this tax credit. And of course, hit that subscribe button down below for more tax tips and tax advice. Now, if you have any questions or concerns related to this tax credit, please leave them in the comments down below and I'll respond as quickly as possible. Thanks so much for watching, guys. For Ask a CPA, again, my name is Brett Phillips and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.